Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full PreFrontal. I'm here with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. Good to be with you. What's in store today?
Let me start with a story. You know Steve Harvey.
Mm-hmm.
He's a beloved comedian, a TV celebrity, and a seasoned host. Extemporaneous speech, that is, talking without a plan, is not a real problem for him. Handling pressure and a playful banter is no biggie for him. So this really is a surprise. What happened is once during Miss Universe pageant, during the last crucial moments, Steve Harvey made a biggest possible blunder. He accidentally said Miss Universe instead of first runner-up when he called out Miss Columbia. Of course, moments later, he realized as he looked at his note card and he said to himself, "Oh my goodness." Later on, as you can imagine, this created a major havoc on the stage as two ladies, one is crying with happiness, one is crying with joy, turns out is not the right winner. And the one who's crying out of sorrow is really the true winner. So Steve Harvey had to manage this chaos. So he went to Twitter and he posted a few tweets. In one, he said, "I would like to apologize wholeheartedly to Miss Columbia and Miss Philippines for my huge mistake. I feel terrible. Secondly, I would like to apologize to the viewers at that I disappointed them as well. Again, it was an honest mistake. I don't want to take away from this amazing night and pageant, as well as the wonderful contestants. They all were amazing." So what happens, as you can imagine, that when we talk, we use language to express ourselves. We express our thoughts through speech, text, tweets, letters, essays. We organize language for talking as well as for writing. And when we organize, when we take time to compose our thoughts, and the flow of language through speech can then make a lot of sense. Sometimes when we are under pressure, organizing ourselves can become a challenge. And a lot of executive functions go into it. So the reason I bring up Steve Harvey is he's a veteran and seasoned comedian, so who knows how to make people laugh. He knows how to manipulate language to have a desired impact. But when you run into a problem, you have to quickly use the same abilities and skills to redirect the attention of his listeners and audience to the right intentions that he have. So we use language to impact our listeners, to convey our intentions and to persuade them, to help them manage their emotions while we are managing our emotions using language. And who better than Dr. Bonnie Singer, who's going to talk about this topic of impact of language on our executive functions and their relationship to each other, and how teaching children these abilities can really improve their learning skills.
Well, I certainly remember that story about Steve Harvey, and it's fascinating to me how through even stories such as that, we can learn things about executive function. So very much looking forward to this conversation. Let's get to it. Here is Sucheta's conversation with Dr. Bonnie Singer.
Today, a fellow speech-language pathologist and an expert in language, literacy, and learning, Dr. Bonnie Singer will be joining us. She is the founder and CEO of the Architects for Learning, where she trains educators and consults with schools worldwide. Dr. Singer received her bachelor's and master's and doctoral degree in communication sciences and disorders from Emerson College, where she has also worked as an instructor and clinical supervisor. In addition, she currently holds an adjunct teaching position in graduate and professional studies at Endicott College. For her entire career, Dr. Singer has been interested in the ways in which language and cognition interrelate to support and constrain language, learning, reading, and writing. With her partner, Dr. Anthony Bashir, she developed Empower, a method for teaching expository writing and brain frames, graphic scaffolding for language, literacy, teaching, and learning. Dr. Singer has authored numerous publications on methods for assessing and teaching writing, reading, listening, speaking, executive functions, self-regulation, higher thinking, and critical literacy. Dr. Singer is committed to the vision that students know how to tackle what comes their way in school and live to the best of their abilities. Welcome to the show, Bonnie.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today.
You and I know each other from our Boston days, and I have always admired your work, particularly the collaboration that you have with Tony Bashir, and we will be talking a lot about that, I hope. My particular interest in our conversation today is the way you relate executive functions to developing language literacy and learning skills. So if I ask you quickly to describe that you met somebody at a coffee shop, what would you say to their question, what is executive functions?
Oh, that's a
quick and dirty.
Quick and dirty. It's basically your brain's air traffic controller.
Tell us more. It's beautiful. I get it.
You're an air traffic controller. You said short. So quick and dirty. There's a lot going on, so your brain's got a lot of processes. There's a lot going on in order to navigate your world and follow what people are saying to you and decide what you're going to do and control your behavior and choose your words and all of that. And somewhere in there, people have likened the executive function system within your brain as the conductor of an orchestra or the air traffic controller or sort of behind the scenes mechanism, neurologically anyway, of coordinating and managing your thinking and your behavior so that you can deal with complicated things.
Got it. And as you and I have come to understand that explaining executive functions is really not a simple one sentence job. You have to kind of back it up with some explanation. So one thing that I always bring into the picture about executive functions is the way you control, guide, direct your behaviors, thoughts, and actions, but they all are related to your future outcomes. So it's not whatever changes you make to yourself, they're basically with one motivation in mind, which is your future self. Is that fair to say about executive functions?
Yeah, it is. They're basically neurological brain-based processes that are recruited in order to do something, or some kind, we call it intentional action. There's some kind of intention that you're attempting to carry out. And so you have to engage these processes in order to do something that's future-oriented.
So you are an expert in language literacy and learning. What connections do you see between that and executive functions?
Well, everything about language in terms of talking is a future-oriented experience, right? And it's always a novel experience. And so one of the things about your executive function system that's important to understand is you don't really have to rely very heavily. It's not very heavily taxed when you're doing something that's really practiced and smooth and automatic. So when you're first learning to tie your shoes, it's a really big deal. Everything about it is new. It's hard. It doesn't feel easy. You have to talk yourself through it. We make up little songs and stuff for kids so they can remember the steps because it's complicated. But after a while, you can be tying your shoes, not even looking at your feet and having a conversation with somebody else because tying your shoes becomes automatic. So you need your executive function system. You need those skills to be brought online and recruited in order to do something. But the more practiced and smooth and automatic that behavior is, or that whatever it is you're doing, the less your executive function system is taxed. So there are certain aspects of communication that with development, become very practiced and automatic. I'm talking to you. I'm not thinking about how to produce a T versus a K sound or where my tongue is to make an S. I've already figured that out, and it just happens automatically from my mouth. Some people, that's not an automatic process. They struggle with just producing speech their whole life, and it takes a lot of executive control in order to do it because they can't get it to be automatic. But language, your ability to formulate an idea and put it into words and express some intended thought or emotion, that's always a brand new event. Our conversations are novel every time we go to say something and interact with somebody or express ourselves on paper. Aside from like your signature, which can become automatic, formulating a thought is always a brand new experience. And so you're never on automatic pilot when you're going to communicate. Your executive system is always engaged in order to be able to be an intentional communicator.
Right. In other words, this can be explained like if I go to Starbucks and my favorite drink there is iced green tea without any syrup, every time I pull around, it's a well rehearsed, well thought out, but it's predictable and same response. So there's nothing novel, nothing. It's smooth and automatic. And so that speech, producing that speech every time at the Starbucks window is part of that automatic response. But then take the reverse, a flip side of this, like a little experience of going to Target and I have to return an item without a receipt. Now I have to plan and organize how I'm going to convince the person, when do you think approximately I bought it or which credit card I use it. So that requires a lot of organizing my thoughts and ideas to create a good sequence so it's cohesive, it's meaningful, and it is novel. So I definitely will be a lot more slower than delivering that order at Starbucks. Correct?
Yeah, it may not be slower. It's just you're taxing your executive system more in order to do it. So you can go to Target and have a perfectly fluent and seemingly automatic conversation about the fact that you don't have your receipt with you. The words come out pretty seamlessly if you have an intact executive system. But the kinds of kids that we've been working with for the last 20, 30 years now are kids where their executive skills have some vulnerabilities in some area. Some aspect of their executive functioning is vulnerable. And so it plays out in their language in different ways. For some kids, they just can't find words quickly enough. So they stumble and they kind of get partway through a sentence and then it's like, oh, wait, that's not exactly what I want to say. So then they backtrack and they start the thought again, or they're repeating words a lot and trying to buy time because they can't seem to get the words planned and organized and sequenced and retrieved quickly enough, have it come out in a very fluid, seamless way.
So Bonnie, help our listeners understand the relationship between prefrontal cortex and executive functions. As you and I have talked about this before, that developing brain definitely has an impact on learning, particularly learning to read and write. And these skills gradually emerge and get polished and get better with time. But a lot of formal years of learning are inundated with demands on reading and writing. So what role does the developing brain play in all this?
Well, you can't learn to read without your brain developing. So, it's sort of the development of your brain is in charge of lots of different processes. And the executive, we think of 5 core, the jury is out on what exactly executive functions consist of. We're still researching and refining, but much of the research that's there points to these 5 core processes, which are inhibition, which is basically like your brain's stopping mechanism, right? You have to stop doing something on automatic in order to have a plan and to organize and sequence your behavior in order to execute that plan and to hold that plan that we call working memory, which is sort of this middle space where I'm keeping it in my mind so that I can work on it while executing a task and managing your emotions and keeping yourself regulated throughout the execution. So those 5 processes are developing slowly throughout your lifetime. They really sort of peak in their development in your mid-20s. And then sadly, we start to become less and less refined in our executive control beyond our mid-20s. But one of the things that is not well understood about executive functions is that those 5 things don't all necessarily develop in unison. So exactly. You can have kids who have really good planning skills and they're just terrible at sequencing what they have to do in order to execute that goal. And you can have kids who are pretty organized, like very organized with their materials, their belongings, but not very organized when they go to talk or to write. You can have kids who are very planful and very organized, but they have such a hard time holding information in their working memory. So it's almost like somebody's writing directions on their little mental whiteboard, but they're using disappearing ink. And all of a sudden they forget what they were going to say in the middle of a sentence. They forget what you just told them. And they're constantly a feeling of, like, wait, what? I forget. So these 5 things don't all develop at the same time, even though executive skills develop through mid-20s. We're not seeing the same rate and the same growth trajectory of those 5 things. So Stus's research shows this really clearly, that they're dissociable, meaning you can have strengths in some aspects of your executive function, weaknesses in others, and vice versa. And it's very individual. So it's not the case that all kids with executive function weaknesses have the same problems. Those weaknesses are going to be very individual to each person based on what's a relative strength within those 5 areas and what's a relative weakness. But you've got to engage all of those skills in order to learn to read, in order to learn to write, in order to do math, in order to acquire any kind of new knowledge, because you have to stop being on automatic pilot long enough to take it in, and then to be able to demonstrate what it is that you know and understand. All of those skills get recruited when we go to explain who Alexander Hamilton was and write a paper about what his major accomplishments were. Anytime we go to use language in a productive way to demonstrate our knowledge and our understanding, we're having to engage our executive function skills in order to do so. So there's a real tight relationship between the executive function system, the language system, and just our rate and growth as learners.
Yes. And what you mentioned about these 5 pillar skills of executive function, that response inhibition, that means you have a good plan and you know it's time to employ the plan. You even have, for example, a graphic organizer. People have told you again and again, make an outline. When it's time to do it, if you don't inhibit, which is you don't stop yourself from doing what doesn't work for you and shift and do what is recommended for you, then you are going to be in the same pickle, which makes you a less successful student. So that brings me to the next question. Typically in your work, what does a struggling student look like? And can you help our listeners distinguish between academic struggles from social or emotional struggles?
It's so unique, because when you really find yourself sort of late, lost, and unprepared, because a little disorganized and behind the 8 ball, and time management is difficult, and just organization across the board may be challenging. It shows up in different ways for kids, but the common themes that we encounter here for kids with executive function is time is somewhat elusive. A lot of kids have a really hard time managing time, knowing how much time it takes for them to do something like their homework. They have a false sense of like, it's only going to take me 10 minutes. And really, writing an 8-page paper takes more than 10 minutes, So their ability to estimate the amount of time something takes is difficult. Their ability to manage themselves in relationship to time demands and when things are due is challenging. Coming up with a system for organizing themselves, organizing their tasks, and making sure that they are monitoring what's due when and getting those things handed in. Those things are really challenging. Lots of times we see kids here in my office, they get their homework done. They diligently do their homework, but then somehow the homework either gets lost between getting it done and get back to school, or it never makes it out of their bag to complete the process of that expected behavior. So we see kids that just aren't really able to consistently sort of manage the expectations of school and the systems of school and the regularities of school consistently enough to demonstrate how bright they are. A lot of these kids are very, very bright, very, very capable in terms of their capacity to think and reason. Many of them have very good reading. Some kids have poor reading skills, and it's impacting, the executive challenges impact their academics, but it depends what aspects of executive function are. When we see kids with working memory limitations, oftentimes we also see comprehension challenges because they just can't hold that much information in their head before they forget. So the way that kids with executive function challenges are going to look in a classroom really depends on what aspects of executive function are hard for them. And it's very unique to an individual. I would say reading comprehension, time management, and organization of behavior, either like knowing how to attack a complex task, like sequencing the steps involved to do something complicated, or organizing your stuff, your materials, can be hard.
Yes, and I think you hit on a very important point, I think, is collectively
these students are not demonstrating that they have the skills and capacity to manage expectations of the schools or keep up with the systems that make them a reliable and consistent student. But at the end side, it creates a big problem because the teachers and educators are left to kind of deal with this. A student who has capacity but is not consistent. And the only way conventional wisdom says I can interpret that is, are you being intentionally difficult? Or why are you not doing what is good for you?
Or just lazy, or you don't care. It's very easy to blame the student. Yep.
So how can we, where is the disconnect? Why are educators, so people like you and I, we have the background in speech and language pathology, we have expertise in executive function. And when we go and educate and train the educators, a lot of my training focuses on particularly the social cognitive aspect of the prefrontal system was developed to help humans manage their relationships. So if you look at the evolutionary reasons for that, and one of the biggest success, what makes the students experience success is the way people perceive this difficulty to be real. And so I spend a lot of time explaining to teachers how this is real. How do you see, what tends to be your focus with your educators when you're dealing with them?
The predominant thing that I focus on when I'm training educators, teachers, not speech language pathologists, but teachers, special educators, and that sort of thing. The two things that I spend most of my time working on is assisting them with developing kids with their writing, because writing is a major, major, major demand on the executive system. So we've developed some very specialized treatment methods and instructional routines for teaching writing, but both writing and organization of language. That's the predominant place where I can get an angle in with teachers.
But how do you explain to them why to do that? Because I definitely want to talk to you about how you do that, but how do you get them to understand why that relates to executive function? And this will remediate that student's capacity to be inconsistent.
Mostly I just focus on the thing that the kid can't do, not the executive function. The backdrop of it is there are executive function weaknesses here, probably. This is how your executive function system works. This is how it's related to writing. But the thing that teachers are concerned about is this kid can't write. I can't understand what he's trying to say. It's totally disorganized. It doesn't make any sense. So if you address the problem that the teacher is having, which is this kid's writing doesn't make any sense, so let me tell you what you can do as a teacher to help this kid's writing make some sense and have some organization coherence to it, they're willing to do that. But working on executive functions for the sake of working on executive functions, I don't think that people have really bought onto that. Sometimes parents will call and say, well, we'd really like you to address the executive function piece. And I spend a lot of time explaining to parents that executive functions aren't a thing. It's not like a thing you go buy at Target. Like, I'd like to get some executive function skills. Like, well, no, they're recruited to do something, right? Exactly. So what is the something that the student is having trouble doing? And let's look at that something and analyze it for what its executive demands are, and then look at what the student is bringing to the table in terms of capacity to meet those executive demands and where that student is falling short, and then what needs to be done in terms of providing outside structure or some sort of remedial therapeutic approach or some additional strategies that we teach the student to employ to shore up that gap between these are the demands, this is what I'm bringing to the table, and this is what I need to do.
Wonderful, Bani. So can you quickly touch upon, for our listeners, what constitute written language disorders and what does it mean to have a written language disorder?
Oh, my goodness. That is a really loaded question.
Yes.
And I'm gonna give you a really provocative answer that is probably not going to be particularly popular with many of your listeners. But I actually don't believe in the existence of a written language disorder.
Go for it, Bonnie. Explain.
So if you look at the DSM, which is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it's like our Bible of, diseases that you can have, yes, right? And the criteria for each of those diagnostic labels. The criteria for a disorder of written expression is that the difficulty that the student is exhibiting with writing cannot be accounted for by any other cognitive limitation or limitation of instruction. And those two things together basically wipe out the existence of a written language disorder all by itself. It doesn't exist because there's always some kind of cognitive or linguistic weakness that's playing, or there isn't, and the student is not a very good writer because they haven't had very good teaching.
That part of DSM is written by a psychologist, not a speech and language pathologist.
Right. Well, it's a reasonable criteria. It's a very reasonable criteria, and I think people omit, they overlook that criteria, which is we have to be able to say that there isn't something else that's causing the student to be struggling before we can slap this disorder label on the student. And I've yet to meet, I think I've only ever met one student in my 30 years where I could definitively say the quality of instruction was extraordinary, and there wasn't anything else cognitively and linguistically that we could point to as being an underlying cause of the difficulty the student was having with writing. Only one.
Wow. So, Bonnie, in closing, one quick question about relationship between writing difficulties and executive functions. As you and I know that ADHD, one of the primary symptoms of ADHD is executive dysfunction. So would every student with ADHD have difficulty with writing?
No, not necessarily.
And can you help our listeners understand?
Many students do. I'm not going to say that as a rule. It's not one of the diagnostic criteria of ADHD, but it is a very common academic area of challenge that we see kids having that also have ADHD. But we also see kids without ADHD really struggling with academic writing as well. So lots of kids struggle with academic writing.
Exactly.
They may or may not also have executive function weaknesses. But by and large, I mean, academic writing, expository writing in particular, requires a lot of planning, a lot of organization, and a lot of working memory. And when you're not a very astute, sort of intuitive pattern detector, some of the patterns of the ways in which we use language in order to develop paragraphs, to develop essays, write an introduction paragraph that has a different pattern than the body paragraph, which has a different paragraph than a different pattern than a conclusion paragraph. You know, language is a bunch of patterns, and you get really good at language when you're a really good pattern detector. Some of our students with attentional limitations are lacking in their pattern detection abilities. They're not getting it just through osmosis, through exposure. They actually just need to be taught very explicitly, this is how it works. This is what language looks like. And there is a pattern under here. This is what it looks like. Here's some strategies for you to use to get comfortable with that pattern and more practiced with that pattern so that it does become more automatic for you.
Beautiful, Bonnie. That brings us to the end of our show. Before I let you go, should anyone have any questions or want to learn more about your work, where should they go?
The best way is through our website. It's architectsforlearning.com.
Fantastic. Thank you once again, Bonnie, for freeing up your time. I know you're such a busy person. Our listeners are really going to learn a lot from your wisdom, and I look forward to staying connected.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
All right, so Cheda, we're back. What a great conversation with Bonnie Singer. She's a speech and language pathologist. She brings a very interesting perspective and lens to the discussion around executive function.
She certainly does, Todd. Bonnie puts it this way: executive function is brain's air traffic controller. While processing complex information and navigating a lot of moving parts, it helps coordinate and manage thinking, and eventually it helps in controlling behaviors, language, and communication to produce results and reach goals. A great way to kind of summarize executive functions.
Absolutely. I would agree with you on that. All right. So any key takeaways from your conversation with Bonnie that we should be aware of?
Here's the first takeaway, Todd. Executive functions are brought online during a new learning process, which requires the brain to move from an autopilot mode so that the new steps or sequences can be coordinated and learned. Certain tasks or situations tax our executive system more than others. For example, when we use language for speaking or writing in a productive way to demonstrate our knowledge and understanding, as she was saying, we very much recruit executive functions. Once a new skill is learned and practiced and mastered, it gets less labored and becomes automatic. At that point, the executive system can take a break. And that's what we call a habit.
Got it. All right. So she describes kids with executive function problems as late, lost, and disorganized. Interesting. Any thoughts there, Sucheta?
Well, that brings us to the second takeaway that bright and capable kids who suffer from executive function difficulties are not able to consistently manage systems that schools have put in place. That's what they appear to in that school context. They're late, they're lost, or they're disorganized. Take an example. A teacher says, come prepared, bring your tools to the classroom. She says, submit your homework through the school portal before Thursday. These are the kind of expectations that are simply expressed in one word, but the student has to manage himself and he has to change his behaviors. He has to orchestrate his actions to actually yield all the things that he needs to do so that he can actually submit the homework through the portal on Thursday. For the kids who have executive function problem and yet bright and capable, time is elusive. They have tremendous difficulty gauging time or estimating how long something will take. And this leads to this false sense of guesstimation and something that should take really 2 hours. They have kept aside only 15 minutes. They go upstairs to their rooms and they come down within 5 minutes saying that I finished studying. And parents are like, you were barely there for 5 minutes. So their own understanding of how to measure time using their own body and experiences of going through a task is really disconnected. Finally, she was talking about these students with executive function problems don't come up with systems to organize themselves. And this is also very much reflected in the way they organize their writing. They don't have a system to writing.
Well, speaking of academic writing, Bonnie also talked about how kids with or without executive function problems or with or without a diagnosis of ADHD all struggle with academic writing.
Yeah, that's the third takeaway that I wanted to kind of share and repeat in a way that writing requires highly engaged executive functions. Writing uses, as Bonnie was saying, 3 important executive functions. First is planning. Second is organization, which is applying pattern detection skills to the writing process, and working memory, where you are holding on to ideas that you are trying to jot down or get on paper. So amongst many types of writing, one such writing, which is academically extremely important, is called expository writing. For those who don't know what expository writing is, here's a quick explanation. It's the kind of writing where a student has to explain an idea, describe the details or the processes in a detailed way, share information, and inform the reader about this knowledge that he's trying to get across in writing. This type of writing is organized around one central topic and heavily depends on patterns that create a sequential delivery of the idea in an organized way. And what's another connection that she made for us? That language is generally highly pattern-centric. And those students who are suffering with executive function problems, whether they have ADHD or don't have ADHD, are really not able to see the patterns in written language. They are supposed to learn this idea of pattern recognition through osmosis or exposure, and they begin to struggle when the advanced academics requires or depends on heavy writing. Take example for in high school, there's something called DBQ, database questions, and that requires students to quickly read something, analyze, synthesize, organize their answers, create a good paragraph summary where in the beginning of the paragraph, there is a definition, description, followed by details or process and a conclusion. This, what I just described, is a pattern, and many students are oblivious to the pattern. And that's when writing becomes tedious and extremely painstaking process. I have worked with many, many students who actually were paralyzed with the proposition of writing and would throw a tantrum or have a massive meltdown. And sometimes they had to literally dictate their essays, and somebody else acted like a note taker, and the person who was taking the notes then acted as an editor and then refined the language, completed the incomplete sentences, and put the thoughts which were barely put together in a cohesive way. So that can be a real challenge.
Fascinating. I mean, lots to think about there. Any final thoughts from this conversation with Bonnie Singer?
Absolutely. I love the way Bonnie talked about that executive functions are behind the scenes neurological skills that get recruited or to do intentional actions and effortful work that is future oriented. And so an average person may not think language requires that. Language is such an effortful process. When I say language, means applying language skills to either speaking or writing. That means getting in front of an audience, and speaking requires a lot of organization. So one should think about executive function. One shouldn't really think about executive functions as a standalone thing. As Bonnie mentioned, she highly encouraged us to think about that executive functions are collective skills that are recruited to do something, to get something out as a result. And let's take an example, whether you're doing a presentation, you're talking to a customer, you're writing a letter of appeal, or let's say you're asking to get a refund for a flight that you had a terrible experience on. Or even imagine you're removing a spoon that's stuck in a garbage disposal requires executive functions. So executive functions are brought on to solve a problem by orchestrating different actions, by creating an internal sequential template, and then walk yourself through that sequential template. And those who do that well really find their work and output is seamless. And those who struggle find their work is interrupted and less fluid, and their success is disjointed.
All right. Critically important conversation with Bonnie Singer. So that's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thanks again for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Full PreFrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.